Women's March on Versailles by Group 5. So what was going on at the time? The Declaration of Man was created and modeled after the Declaration of Independence in hopes of creating a new constitution. France was run under an absolute monarchy by Louis XVI. However, in 1789, due to poor harvests for several years, grain was scarce and the price of bread in Paris had increased beyond a reasonable price. Sellers were anxious about the shrinking market, and this led to uncertainty and general anxiety. The main food for commoners in France was bread, and due to the poor economy, it led to a scarcity of bread and high prices. The people were hungry. Since women would go to the market to buy bread for their families, they were angry to find that there was little bread available and it was very expensive. What was the Women's March on Versailles? The Women's March on Versailles, also known as the October March or just the March on Versailles, was one of the earliest and most significant events of the French Revolution. On the morning of October 5th, 1789, women in the marketplaces of Paris were near rioting over the high price and scarcity of bread.
Women's March on Versailles took place on October 5th, 1789, which was an important event of French Revolution, and women were the prominent part of the march. Over 6,000 to 7,000 marchers were there, including many of the soldiers in the National Guard. Due to the high cost and limited supply of bread, occurrence of fostered discontent and fear, leading market women and women consumers to show their concern by marching on foot to Versailles. During the march, the women were led by one of the leaders named Stanislas Marie Maillard. After 6 hours of marching to the king's palace in Versailles, they demanded to meet the king upon their arrival. After the king spoke to the small group of women, he came to an agreement with them and promised that he will help them with provision. Continuation of women's march led to fights and some guards were killed, but then eventually peace was restored by Marquis de Lafayette, the leader of the National Guard. King then addressed the crowd from the balcony, and the crowd demanded King to return to Paris with them. They also demanded to see Queen Marie Antoinette, and additionally blamed a lot of their problems on the Queen and her lavish spending. Then the Queen appeared on the balcony with her children, but the crowd demanded the children to be taken away from her. The crowd pointed guns at her while she stood there by herself. But Lafayette knelt before her on the balcony and kissed her hand. She could have died, but this made crowd to calm down and allowed her to live. The king and queen then traveled back to Paris with the crowd. By this time, the crowd had grown from around 7,000 to 60,000 marchers. The king then went to live at Tuileries Palace in Paris and never saw his beautiful palace in Versailles.
The Women's March on Versailles had a long-lasting and serious effect on both the French Revolution and the rest of the world. The women and men that marched on Versailles brought about some of the biggest changes in the history of France by essentially ending the absolute independence that the French monarchs had enjoyed for so many centuries. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette no longer held the absolute power that their predecessors had. When the protesters forced them out of Versailles and into Paris, this demonstrated a significant shift in power towards the Third Estate, or the commoners. The commoners, along with the help of the army, managed to humiliate the king. Since the commoners had control of the king, they now essentially had control of the entire country as well. The March on Versailles also represented a huge political shift in the importance of women, both in France and in the political world. The march showed that men and women could work together towards a common goal in a time when men thought that women had no role outside of the home. The women demonstrated that they were just as politically influential and relevant as any man, commoner or noble. Beyond just the immediate effects on the French Revolution, this march led to a surge in writing and demonstrations for women's rights. After the creation of the National Assembly and the March on Versailles, there was a boom in pamphlets and lectures about women's role in politics. During the 1790s, women began to attend political clubs previously only for men, and even started their own clubs. These political clubs petitioned the National Assembly to create progressive laws for equality in education and marriage. Although Napoleon's rise to power at the end of the 18th century stopped any significant progress for women in France, the ideas that sprang from the march laid the groundwork for all the women's rights movements that developed afterwards.